In 1985, the small town of Riverdale, Ohio, with a population of about 12,000 people, lived a measured life. It was a time when America was experiencing an economic boom, and in small towns, people knew each other by name. Riverdale was a typical American suburb: neat houses with lawns, a local school, a church where almost everyone went on Sundays, and several cafes where the news was discussed. In this quiet place, no one expected that a family drama would turn the life of one of the local families upside down and shock the entire community. The story that unfolded began unnoticed but led to tragic consequences, leaving a mark on the memory of the residents. We are talking about the Patterson family, whose life seemed ordinary until circumstances were revealed that no one could have predicted. This story is based on real events, taking into account the social and cultural characteristics of that time. The Patterson family lived on the outskirts of Riverdale in a two-story house with a white picket fence. The father, Robert Patterson, 47, worked as a foreman at the local lumber mill. His wife, Margaret, 44, was a secretary at the town hall. They had two children, Sarah, 23, and Michael, 21. Sarah, a slender girl with auburn hair, had recently graduated from nursing school and had returned home while she looked for work at the regional hospital. Michael, a broad-shouldered young man with dark eyes, was studying business at the community college and worked weekends at his father's mill. Neighbors described the Pattersons as an exemplary family. They regularly hosted neighborhood barbecues, never missed Sunday service, and participated in every town festival. Sarah and Michael had been inseparable since childhood. They spent countless hours together, building tree forts in the backyard, racing their bicycles through the winding streets, and attending every high school football game as a pair. Their parents encouraged this bond, believing it strengthened the family unit that was so important in their conservative community. In the spring of 1985, when Sarah returned home from nursing school, their relationship seemed to deepen in ways that initially appeared harmless. They would disappear for long walks, discussing Sarah's experiences in the city and Michael's plans after graduation. Sarah would help Michael with his business studies, and he would drive her to job interviews in neighboring towns. Their conversations stretched late into the night, often continuing in hushed tones on the front porch long after their parents had retired. Riverdale was a town where tradition mattered. Family values and moral standards were not just ideals, they were the foundation upon which the community was built. The local Baptist church, where Reverend Coleman delivered passionate sermons about righteousness and proper conduct, served as the moral compass for most residents. Any deviation from accepted norms was not just frowned upon, it was considered a threat to the very fabric of their society. The Pattersons, like many others, had built their reputation on adhering to these expectations without question. However, as the warm months of 1985 progressed, subtle changes began to occur in the Patterson household that escaped the notice of Robert and Margaret, but did not go entirely unobserved by others. Sarah and Michael began declining invitations to social gatherings, preferring each other's company to that of their peers. Sarah's nursing school friends would call, inviting her to reunions or parties in the city, but she consistently made excuses. Michael, who had been popular in high school and maintained friendships with several local young men, gradually withdrew from their circle. The siblings developed their own private world. They created inside jokes that made them burst into laughter at the dinner table, leaving their parents smiling but puzzled. They began taking long drives in Michael's old pickup truck, supposedly to help Sarah practice driving to potential job sites, but these excursions often lasted for hours with no clear destination or purpose. By midsummer, their behavior began to attract attention from those who knew them well. Mrs. Helen Foster, who lived next door and had watched the Patterson children grow up, noticed that Sarah and Michael had developed certain habits that struck her as unusual. They would sit closer together on the porch swing than seemed necessary, their hands occasionally brushing in ways that lingered a moment too long. When greeting each other after time apart, their embraces seemed more intense than typical sibling affection. Sarah began keeping a journal during this period, writing in it religiously each night before bed. In her neat handwriting, she documented feelings she couldn't share with anyone else. She wrote about the confusion of loving someone so deeply while knowing that society would never understand or accept those feelings. Michael, meanwhile, became increasingly restless. His grades at the community college began to slip, and his supervisor at the lumber mill noted that he seemed distracted during work shifts. The social environment of 1980s Riverdale created an atmosphere where the Patterson siblings felt they had to be increasingly secretive about their growing emotional connection. The conservative values that surrounded them left no room for ambiguity or explanation. Television shows and movies of the era reinforced traditional family structures, while the local church community actively discouraged any behavior that might be considered unconventional. In July 1985, Sarah and Michael began meeting in secret locations around town. They discovered an old hunting cabin deep in the woods behind the mill, abandoned for years but still structurally sound. This became their private sanctuary, a place where they could talk freely without fear of being overheard or observed. They would arrive separately, Sarah claiming she was going for walks to clear her head while job hunting, and Michael saying he was scouting locations for hunting season. These clandestine meetings became the highlight of both their days. They would bring books to read aloud to each other, share dreams about their futures, and discuss the increasing difficulty of hiding their feelings from their parents and the community. Sarah wrote in her journal about the guilt that consumed her, how she prayed every night for strength to overcome what she knew was wrong, yet found herself unable to stay away from these moments of connection with Michael. The burden of their secret began to manifest in other ways. Sarah became irritable with her mother, snapping at innocent questions about her job search or her social life. Michael grew distant from his father, avoiding the man-to-man conversations about his future that Robert tried to initiate. Both siblings began losing weight, their appetites diminished by the constant stress of maintaining their facade.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
In August, their careful routine was nearly exposed when Tommy Bradley, one of Michael's former classmates, spotted them walking together on a seldom-used trail near Miller's Creek. Tommy later mentioned to friends at the local diner that he'd seen the Patterson kids hiking together, which seemed odd since Michael had always claimed to prefer hunting and fishing alone. The comment made its way through the small-town gossip network, eventually reaching the ears of several church members who began paying closer attention to the family's activities. Margaret Patterson was the first parent to notice concrete changes in her children's behavior. In early September, she found Sarah crying quietly in her room one afternoon. When Margaret pressed for an explanation, Sarah claimed she was overwhelmed by the job search process and worried about her future. Margaret accepted this explanation, but made a mental note to watch her daughter more closely. Around the same time, Robert observed that Michael had become secretive about his whereabouts, often claiming to be at the library or with friends. But when Robert called to check, the stories didn't always align. The siblings, sensing the increased scrutiny, became even more careful. They developed a system of coded communication, leaving notes for each other in predetermined hiding spots around the house and town. Sarah would place a particular book on the kitchen windowsill to signal a meeting, while Michael would respond by positioning his baseball cap in a specific way on his bedroom dresser. These subtle signs allowed them to coordinate their secret encounters without arousing suspicion. However, their efforts to remain undetected were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The emotional strain was taking its toll on both of them. Sarah's journal entries from this period reveal a young woman torn between her feelings and her moral upbringing. She wrote about sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was losing her mind or if what she felt was somehow natural despite everything she'd been taught. Michael, lacking an outlet for his emotions like Sarah's journal, began drinking beer alone in his room, a habit that didn't go unnoticed by his father. The situation reached a critical point in October 1985 when Margaret made a discovery that shattered her understanding of her family. While cleaning Sarah's room, she accidentally knocked over a loose floorboard and discovered the hiding place where Sarah kept her most private possessions. Among them was the journal, filled with entries that left Margaret stunned and horrified. The pages detailed not just Sarah's internal struggle, but also explicit descriptions of her relationship with Michael and their secret meetings. Margaret's hands shook as she read passage after passage that confirmed her worst fears. Sarah had written about stolen kisses in the abandoned cabin, about lying awake at night thinking of Michael, about the torture of pretending everything was normal during family dinners. The journal painted a picture of two young people who had crossed boundaries that Margaret had never imagined possible in her own family. That evening, Margaret waited until Michael was at his evening class before confronting Sarah. The conversation took place in the living room, with Margaret holding the journal like evidence in a courtroom. Sarah's initial denials crumbled quickly under her mother's direct questioning and the undeniable proof of her own words. Through tears, Sarah admitted that her relationship with Michael had evolved beyond what siblings should share. But she begged her mother to understand that neither of them had intended for it to happen. Margaret was devastated. She had raised her children according to every moral principle she believed in, attended church faithfully, and tried to be an example of Christian motherhood. The revelation that her own children had violated one of society's most fundamental taboos left her feeling like a failure as a parent and a moral person. She told Sarah that she would need to discuss the situation with Robert, but first demanded that Sarah promise to end whatever was happening with Michael immediately. When Robert returned home that night, Margaret was waiting for him in the kitchen with red-rimmed eyes and the journal placed on the table between them. She explained what she had discovered, watching as her husband's face progressed through stages of disbelief, anger, and disgust. Robert's reaction was more explosive than Margaret had anticipated. He slammed his fist on the table, declaring that he had not worked his entire life to build a respectable family, only to have it destroyed by such behavior. The next morning, Robert confronted Michael before he left for college. The conversation took place in the garage where Robert cornered his son and demanded an explanation. Michael, caught off guard and realizing that their secret was finally exposed, tried to explain that what had happened between him and Sarah wasn't something they had planned or wanted, but something that had developed naturally over time. This explanation only fueled Robert's anger further, and he forbade Michael from being alone with Sarah ever again. The family dynamics changed overnight. Margaret began monitoring Sarah's every move, while Robert watched Michael with suspicion and disappointment. Meals became tense affairs with forced conversation and underlying hostility. Sarah was forbidden from leaving the house without her mother's permission, while Michael found himself subjected to unexpected visits from his father at school and worked to verify his whereabouts. Despite their parents' vigilance, Sarah and Michael found ways to communicate. They left notes and books at the public library and made brief phone calls when their parents were occupied. These stolen moments of contact only intensified their feelings for each other and their resentment toward their parents for trying to keep them apart. Sarah wrote in a new, hidden journal about feeling like a prisoner in her own home, while Michael confided to his friend Danny Carter that his parents were treating him like a criminal over something they didn't understand. The pressure of maintaining their separation while living in the same house created an atmosphere of constant tension. Sarah began having panic attacks, while Michael started getting into fights at school over perceived slights and insults. Their behavior became increasingly erratic, drawing attention from teachers, employers, and community members who had known them their entire lives. In November 1985, the situation escalated when Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The realization came after weeks of feeling ill and missing her period, symptoms she had initially attributed to stress. A home pregnancy test confirmed her worst fears, and she knew immediately that Michael was the father. The discovery sent her into a state of panic as she realized that their secret could no longer be hidden and that the consequences would be far more severe than anything they had previously faced. Sarah waited for an opportunity to tell Michael privately, finally managing to pass him a note during a church service that simply read, "We need to talk. Tonight. Urgent." They arranged to meet at their old hiding place in the abandoned cabin, both knowing that they were taking a significant risk by defying their parents' restrictions. The conversation that took place that night was emotionally charged and desperate. Sarah told Michael about the pregnancy through tears, watching as the color drained from his face. They both understood that their situation had moved from being a shameful family secret to something that would soon become impossible to hide from the entire community. Sarah was adamant that they needed to leave Riverdale together, start fresh somewhere else where no one knew their history. Michael was torn between his feelings for Sarah and his understanding of the practical impossibilities of their situation. Their discussion grew heated as Michael tried to convince Sarah that running away would only make things worse, while she insisted that staying would destroy both their lives and potentially the life of their unborn child. The conversation continued for hours, with both of them becoming increasingly emotional and desperate. At some point during their argument, Michael mentioned that maybe it would be better if Sarah considered other options regarding the pregnancy, a suggestion that sent Sarah into a rage. The argument escalated beyond anything they had experienced before. Sarah accused Michael of abandoning her and their child, while Michael tried to explain that he was thinking about what would be best for everyone involved. Their voices rose and their emotions reached a breaking point. In the heat of the moment, Michael grabbed Sarah's arm to try to calm her down, but she pulled away violently and lost her balance, hitting her head hard against the corner of an old wooden table in the cabin. The sound of the impact was sickeningly loud in the small space. Sarah collapsed to the floor, blood immediately beginning to pool beneath her head. Michael dropped to his knees beside her, calling her name and trying to wake her, but she was unconscious and unresponsive. Panic overtook him as he realized the severity of what had happened. He tried to stop the bleeding with his jacket, but it was clear that Sarah needed immediate medical attention. Michael ran to his truck and drove as fast as he could to the nearest phone, which was at a gas station about 5 miles away. He called for an ambulance, giving the dispatcher directions to the cabin, but he knew in his heart that it might be too late. When he returned to the cabin, Sarah was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes, but the paramedics quickly determined that Sarah's injuries were severe and that she needed to be airlifted to the Regional Trauma Center in Columbus. Sarah died during the helicopter flight to the hospital, never regaining consciousness. The official cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head resulting from an accidental fall. However, the circumstances surrounding her death quickly became the subject of intense investigation and community speculation. Michael was arrested at the hospital and charged with manslaughter. The investigation revealed the full extent of his relationship with Sarah, including the pregnancy, which the autopsy confirmed. The scandal rocked Riverdale to its core as residents struggled to comprehend how such a tragedy could occur in their tight-knit community. The trial began in March 1986 and became the most significant legal proceeding in the town's history. The courthouse was packed daily with residents, reporters, and curiosity seekers from neighboring communities. Michael's defense attorney argued that Sarah's death was a tragic accident that occurred during an emotional conversation between two young people who were struggling with circumstances beyond their understanding or control. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Michael had deliberately struck Sarah during their argument, and that her death was the result of his violent reaction to her pregnancy and demands that they leave town together. They presented evidence from Sarah's journal, testimony from family members about the restrictions placed on the siblings, and expert testimony about the nature of Sarah's injuries. The testimony was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Margaret took the stand and described finding Sarah's journal and confronting her daughter about the relationship. Her voice broke as she testified about her attempts to protect her family and her failure to prevent the tragedy that followed. Robert testified about his confrontation with Michael and his efforts to separate the siblings, admitting that he felt responsible for not taking more decisive action sooner. Michael's testimony was the most anticipated moment of the trial. He took the stand in his own defense, describing his relationship with Sarah as something that had developed gradually and naturally, despite their understanding that it was wrong. He insisted that he had never intended to hurt Sarah and that her death was the result of a terrible accident during an emotionally charged conversation. He broke down while describing the moments after Sarah fell, his desperate attempts to save her, and his realization that he had lost the person he loved most in the world. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching their verdict. They found Michael guilty of voluntary manslaughter, concluding that while he may not have intended to kill Sarah, his actions during their argument had directly led to her death. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison, noting that while the circumstances were tragic and unusual, Michael had to be held accountable for his role in Sarah's death. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the community, though the Patterson family tragedy continued to reverberate through Riverdale for years to come. Robert and Margaret divorced within a year of the trial, unable to overcome the grief and guilt that consumed their marriage. Margaret moved to Florida to live with her sister, while Robert remained in Riverdale but became increasingly isolated from the community that had once embraced his family. Michael served 12 years of his sentence before being granted parole in 1998. He was required to register as a sex offender due to the nature of his relationship with Sarah, and he left Ohio immediately upon his release. Reports suggested that he changed his name and settled somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, but no one from Riverdale ever confirmed his whereabouts. The abandoned cabin where Sarah died was torn down by the county within months of the trial, but the location remained a somber reminder of the tragedy for those who knew its history. The Patterson house was eventually sold to a family from out of state who were unaware of its significance, though local residents never forgot what had happened there. In the years that followed, the case became a cautionary tale within the community about the importance of family communication and the dangers of keeping secrets. Reverend Coleman used the tragedy as an example in his sermons about the consequences of moral failure, though he was careful to emphasize forgiveness and redemption rather than judgment. The story of Sarah and Michael Patterson became part of Riverdale's local folklore, passed down through generations as a reminder of how quickly a family's life can unravel when boundaries are crossed and secrets are kept. It served as a stark illustration of the complex interplay between individual desires, family dynamics, and community expectations in small-town America during the 1980s. For those who remembered Sarah alive, her bright smile at church gatherings, her gentle manner with children, her dreams of becoming a nurse, her death represented not just a family tragedy, but a loss of innocence for the entire community. The knowledge that someone they had watched grow up could become involved in such circumstances forced many residents to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and the limits of moral certainty. Justice, in its legal sense, had been served through Michael's conviction and imprisonment. He had been held accountable for his actions and had paid the price demanded by society for his role in Sarah's death. The legal system had functioned as intended, weighing the evidence and reaching a verdict that reflected both the gravity of the crime and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. Yet for many in Riverdale, true justice remained elusive. Sarah was gone, taking with her any chance of understanding her perspective on the events that led to her death. The pregnancy that had precipitated the final confrontation represented another life lost, another future that would never be realized. Robert and Margaret had lost both their children, one to death and one to the prison system, leaving them to grapple with questions about their own role in the tragedy. The case ultimately served as a reminder that justice in its purest form extends beyond courtrooms and legal proceedings. It encompasses the moral reckonings that individuals and communities must face when confronted with circumstances that challenge their fundamental beliefs and assumptions. In Riverdale, the Patterson tragedy forced a collective examination of how rigid social expectations and the inability to address difficult topics openly can contribute to devastating outcomes. The story continues to resonate today as a powerful example of how family secrets, societal pressure, and individual choices can intersect in ways that forever alter the lives of everyone involved. It stands as a testament to the importance of communication, understanding, and compassion in addressing complex human situations, while also demonstrating that some choices carry consequences that can never be fully undone or forgiven. The memory of Sarah Patterson lives on in Riverdale through a small memorial garden planted behind the church she attended faithfully throughout her short life. It serves as a quiet reminder of a young woman whose life ended tragically, but whose story continues to teach important lessons about love, family, and the sometimes devastating consequences of keeping dangerous secrets. If this story has moved you or made you think about the complex nature of family relationships and community values, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these important stories that explore the darker corners of human experience and the pursuit of justice in all its forms. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you in the next episode.